Jujutsu Kaisen is a series where mentality trumps all. Fear, selfishness, and anger all accumulate into strength due to the nature of cursed energy being negative emotions. How exactly does the system of one's inner self work, and how relatable can these characters really be? Well, it's actually more simple yet more complex than you probably think, and I wanted to take a look at examples of this in the series. This sort of idea that flocking together with other people and not taking hold of your own desires is most represented in, I would say, the two strongest characters in Jujutsu Kaisen, Gojo and Sukuna. A prime example of this is when Sukuna is talking to Jogo after beating him in Shibuya, and Sukuna tells Jogo that this idea of humans flocking together, curses flocking together, and them comparing themselves to each other leads to weakness and stunts their growth. He tells Jogo that he should have burnt everything he desired to reach the heights of Satoru Gojo, and that worrying about his future or his identity stopped him from growing in strength. In fact, I think that there is a near one-to-one comparison that you can use to represent exactly what Sukuna is talking about in a practical sense, that being Mahito. Mahito unlocked and fully evolved his ISB form when he understood the true essence of his soul, and this is absolutely no coincidence. Yes, a technical difference is that Mahito had landed black flashes, allowing him to understand his powers better, but I think the real difference in what the narrative is trying to tell us is that the reason that these black flashes had even happened is because Mahito had this hunger that Jogo had lacked. This idea of hunger and interest is also relayed through Sukuna once again in Shinjuku. There's a reason why Gojo had landed a multitude of black flashes on Mahoraga, Agito, and Sukuna, whereas Sukuna had landed none on Gojo. It's simply because of the thrill of the fight and interest. Now, it's fairly obvious to us readers that Gojo had this unwavering notion that he must kill Sukuna before he even attempts to consider saving Megumi. Using this to his advantage, Gojo is able to enter the zone and land black flashes on Sukuna in an awakened state. Sukuna also found himself in a similar zone when combating Maki, since it stated that he was the most interested in Maki than he was in basically anyone else he ever fought. This sorta backs up the idea that interest and hunger once again plays a role into black flashes and just a better understanding of your CE in general, and also just the idea of growing stronger. This is also illustrated to us much earlier in the series when we see that Hanami and Mahito have a conversation whilst Hanami is combating Yuji and Todo. Mahito tells Hanami that he feels his spirit is being constrained and that just because that him and the others have gained a reasoning doesn't mean that they should deny their impulses. He tells Hanami that Hanami should be more like himself. In response, Hanami says that, well, he is himself, but that's not really exactly what Mahito's getting at. Essentially, what Mahito is trying to say is that Hanami should enjoy whatever he does and not constrain himself. And we see as soon as Hanami starts to have fun while fighting Yuji and Todo, he seemingly becomes stronger, and this is also supported by what Mahito says, saying that he believes that Hanami is much stronger. Now, I had somewhat touched upon this earlier, but I just want to explain real quick how this even all connects to the power system and how this all makes sense. Cursed energy is just negative emotions, and we see when people get negative emotions, they tend to get stronger. The two most blatant examples I can think of off the top of my head is Yuji saying that when fighting Choso he felt fear and he was able to turn his fear into cursed energy, thereby allowing him to better combat Choso. The other example is, well, also a Yuji example, and it's him in the Culling games when he gets super angry at Sukuna after he took over Megumi's body. When Sukuna first enters Megumi's body, he's able to send Yuji flying back through multiple buildings with a single punch. After Yuji recovers to his best ability, he comes back at Sukuna screaming his name and obviously very angry. He has this sort of rage amp, white eyes type moment that a lot of shonen MCs get, and after this, Sukuna notices that Yuji has gotten much stronger. Some people might think that this is because he had his output nerfed due to being in Megumi's body and Megumi holding back his attacks when Sukuna aims attacks at his friends. However, I don't think that's the case. For one, cursed energy does just make you stronger based off emotions, so it would make sense for Yuji to be stronger, but also Sukuna didn't notice any sort of nerf or Yuji being stronger or tougher than usual when he first punched him. He only noticed this after Yuji got the white eyes and got super angry. Not to mention that Sukuna only notices an output nerf after he uses his curse technique for the first time, and while fighting Yuji and Aki, he makes a comment that he's able to move his body perfectly fine, and rather it's really his curse technique output that has dropped. Now, make no mistake, it's absolutely no coincidence that Gojo and Sukuna display this idea of selfishness more than basically anyone else in JJK. It's because that these sort of emotions tie to them being the strongest. Now, it's kind of ironic for me to say this in all honesty, since if you know me or have seen me be on other people's streams like on Bubbles' channel, you know that I'm but rather definitely a Kashimo hater. I think he kind of sucks in terms of strength. However, what I will admit is that Kashimo, out of everyone being Yuta and the other heavy hitters, probably understands Gojo and Sukuna more than they do. Kashimo tells everyone spectating the Gojo and Sukuna fight that they don't really understand Gojo and Sukuna's mentality. He says that this fight is for Gojo himself, and to intervene would be a sort of insult to Gojo himself. Not even necessarily that they would ruin Gojo's chances of winning, even though that is also true. This is also why after Sukuna tells Gojo that he was magnificent, Gojo smiles, and this is the last scene that we see from Gojo. Or at least, that doesn't include flashbacks. Gojo further elaborates on this when he tells Geto in the afterlife that he was trying to prove himself to the King of Curses. However, he couldn't really succeed in that to the extent that he wished he could, since he was going all out. However, Sukuna needed to hold back. Sukuna also tells Kashima that he enjoys passing time by doing whatever he wants, playing with whatever amuses him, and eating humans whenever he feels like it. He says that this may be hard to understand for other people, but that doesn't really bother him at all. This selfishness, I would say, is honestly displayed even more explicitly by Teen Gojo than it is by modern day Gojo. In his inner monologue, Gojo apologizes to Amanai, saying that he's sorry, but he doesn't really feel vengeance towards everyone right now. He kinda just feels perfect, and he makes the statement that he alone is the honored one. This also marks the start of Gojo being the strongest, which is commented on by Toji himself. Gojo breaking this barrier between one's own self and the cares of the world allowed him to reach heights that once were thought to be not possible. This idea of simply engaging and acting towards one's desires at hand in the moment and not really giving a care for anything else in the world is pretty consistent with the emotions that are tied to strength in Jujutsu Kaisen. Gojo asks Geto if they should kill the humans that wanted Amanai to die. Geto tells Gojo that there's no point and that they aren't even the higher-ups, and the higher-ups are probably somewhere else. Gojo questions if there being a point or a reason even matters, and Geto tells him that, well, as a Jujutsu sorcerer, it has to matter. This idea is once again echoed through the King of Curses in Yuji's domain at the end of the series. Yuji tells Sukuna that he loathes him and that humans aren't just tools to be played with. He also tells Sukuna that he doesn't know if humans are good or evil by nature, and he's kind of confused on humanity itself and the humanity of someone other than your own self. Sukuna understands everything that Yuji is saying, however he tells Yuji that he doesn't feel a thing. He compares this to when Yuji saw how quiet this town had become. Gojo also explains this idea to Megumi, when he tells Megumi that him and Yuji reach for the fences, whereas Megumi goes for bunt shots. This analogy is from a baseball game that they had been playing, and he basically just tells Megumi that yes, while Jujutsu sorcery and fighting as a Jujutsu sorcerer involves companionship and teamwork, Jujutsu sorcerers die alone in the end no matter what, and that being a Jujutsu sorcerer is a one-man sport. He tells Megumi that he should focus on himself rather than always trying to help others if he wants any chance to surpass him or even just to surpass Nanami. He tells Megumi that winning by dying and winning even if you die are two completely different things. We also get a direct parallel between Yuji and Modulo and Gojo. Before fighting Sukuna, Gojo tells Yuji that Satoru Gojo hardly matters now, and that even if he dies in the current state that he's in, everyone will grow up to surpass him at the end of the day anyway. Yuji similarly also tells the reporter in Modulo that Yuji Itadori hardly matters and no one really cares. The cycle of life will continue. However, don't get it twisted, this doesn't diminish these people's egos at all. In fact, right after Gojo tells Yuji that Satoru Gojo doesn't matter, he tells Yuji that he's naive for thinking that he wasn't sure of himself, and he says that he's never been more sure of himself, and he also tells Yuji that he's counting on him. I also wanted to mention how Yuta, even though he's one of the strongest people in JJK, is somehow an exception to this whole ego and selfishness thing. It's pretty consistent through a multitude of statements that Yuta is a rather selfless individual and always puts his friends ahead of him. He's just an all-around really nice guy. In fact, Uro and Ryu both point out that Yuta shouldn't have held back on them, and rather he should have fought with the intent to kill. One thing that's absolutely related to emotions, ego, and selflessness in Jujutsu Kaisen is this idea of Satoru Gojo being the strongest. And I don't mean in the conventional sense where he's the strongest sorcerer, but rather it's a little deeper than that. Our first glimpse of this is when Geto tells Gojo that he's trying to convince Geto that he's doing the impossible when Gojo could do it himself. Geto then says the legendary line, "Are you the strongest because you're Satoru Gojo, or are you Satoru Gojo because you're the strongest?" And I do believe that this question is actually answered within the series. Throughout the course of the series, Gojo is absolutely desperate to find someone who will surpass him. He even goes as far as to say as people like Todo and the sorcerers of the next generation will surpass the milestone of special grade. He also notes that Hikari, Yuta, and Yuji will one day too surpass him. Kenjaku makes it kinda clear that Gojo is just wrong. He tells Gojo that there can never be another Satoru Gojo. This in itself already kind of answers Geto's question, but I do believe that it's a little deeper than just that. Yuta entering Gojo's body is even further proof of what Kenjaku says, in my opinion. When Yuta enters Gojo's body, there are, sure, surface level things that sorta entail that Yuta isn't as strong as Gojo. For one, he goes relative with a Sukuna that was much weaker than the Sukuna that fought Gojo, but aside from that, he also can't properly control the body since Gojo's limb sizes are different than Yuta's. Him not being able to use the 6 eyes and limitless as well as Gojo seems to me that Gojo himself is the reason for why he is this strong. Keep in mind that abilities like 10 Shadows are kinda crap unless the person using them is also really powerful. This seems to be consistent in JJK and it seems to align with the 6 eyes and limitless. Sure, Gojo was extremely talented and gifted at birth, but if it wasn't for Gojo himself, there can't really be anyone as strong as him. This narrative also plays into why Gojo tells Yuji that he wants him to surpass Gojo, but in different ways than how Gojo became the strongest. To me, it seemed like Gojo kind of resolved himself and accepted this idea of who he is as a person, which allowed him to have a clear mind against the King of Curses. I also just wanted to touch on what I meant when I said curse techniques and just general attacks in JJK are amped and differ based on the user's strength themselves. Kenjaku tells Choso about this when he says that he can amp low-level cursed spirits to beat on a grade 1 sorcerer like Choso himself by simply applying his own cursed energy to it. Sukuna's divine dogs also seem a lot stronger than Megumi's since they appear to be larger and also appear to take on a slightly different form than Megumi's do. They also can react to Yorozu, which it's pretty clear that Megumi's can't and clearly aren't fast enough to react to someone on that level of sorcery. In response to this, some people may bring up the fact that Gege said that the Mahoraga that Megumi, Sukuna, and Yuka all summoned were initially the same strength, however, Yuka's had adapted to more things in the fight against Dabura, therefore that Mahoraga is the strongest. I don't really think what Gege says means that the Mahoragas can't be different in strength. What I think Gege was talking about was the adaptation itself, and we simply see through Megami's Divine Dogs versus Sukuna's Divine Dogs, and Megami's Nue versus Sukuna's Nue, that I think Sukuna clearly does amp 10 shadows with his cursed energy. Now, there is one thing that I haven't fully touched on in this video that is related to the strongest mentality, that being loneliness. However, I did this for a very specific reason, and I plan on making a loneliness video with Kashimo, Yorozu, Sukuna, and Gojo at another time, and I also potentially plan on including Mojo Yuji, so stay tuned for that. And yeah, I just wanted to explain why I didn't touch on loneliness in this video specifically. But anyways, that's pretty much all I wanted to cover, and I think I did a fairly decent job of explaining what this is. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments. Make sure to drop a like and sub, and yeah, this is Static. Peace out.